The Senate held a hearing and heard from FBI Director Christopher Wray about the agency's response, or lack thereof, to the January 6th fascist insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Oddly enough, this is the first time that the director made any public comments about the event since it happened. And I think it's odd because while I get that Wray was pretty much hoping that he wouldn't be fired by Trump as the petulant little tantrum was on his way out of the White House, that is, to me, a lame reason not to do your job. Which, of course, brings to my mind the reputation of the FBI as the agency that has been much more active in demonizing Black and left activists than it has been in focusing on what we have all known has always been the real threat in this country, white supremacist terrorism. With the incredibly long history of racist violence in this country being what it has always been, and having never been truly addressed, the FBI should have been better prepared for January 6th. But we talked last week about that FBI memo behind why they weren't. Because inside the Bureau, angry white people who sincerely believed their white supremacist messiah actually won an election that he didn't, who posted threats and plans to carry out violence to install their leader on the day the Electoral College votes were certified, that wasn't seen as an actual threat to agency officials and state and local law enforcement. Remember that I told you last week that the FBI issued that report to local law enforcement the day before the attack that outlined the threats and plans of groups that were coming to Washington, D.C. to take back their stolen election, and highlighted those threats of violence to people and property in the emails they were monitoring, but ultimately concluded that, quote, individuals, organizations named in this report have been identified as participating in activities that are protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Their inclusion here is not intended to associate the protected activity with criminality or a threat to national security, or to infer that such protected activity itself violates federal law, end quote. So today, Wray faces the Senate to answer for the FBI's lack of response to what they themselves distributed as credible threats of violence from white people. And honestly, I don't know what anyone is expecting to come out of this political theater other than some dramatic moments of feigned outrage and some declarations from politicians stating the obvious, because it's pretty ridiculous that 147 years after the White League was formed on March 1st, 1874, that there still needs to be hearings to declare that white racist terrorist violence is still a thing in this country. What's the White League? Well, the White League was a group of former Confederate soldiers who believed that they were the defenders of a, quote, hereditary civilization and Christianity, and vowed to use terrorism to end Reconstruction and reestablish white supremacist social order in the U.S. According to the Zen Education Project, the White League was a paramilitary group that targeted local Republican office holders for assassination and terrorized freed people to keep them from voting, from political organizing, and from getting an education. Their threats were not empty hyperbole either. They murdered Julia Hayden, a 17-year-old African-American school teacher, within 3 days of her starting to work at a school for freed people in Tennessee in the fall of 1874. And organizations like the White League were started in other places too, like the White Line and the Red Shirts, which were organized in Mississippi in 1875 and in South and North Carolina in 1876. And the violent racist terrorism of organizations like these, as well as that of regular white citizens and the entire society structures and institutions that enabled them all, continued after Reconstruction governments were violently overthrown after Reconstruction ended, and then Jim Crow was installed in the aftermath. And it was this same violent racist terrorism that enforced that legal segregation and white supremacist dominance in the South and through less formal segregation and discrimination that was equally as violent in the rest of the country that continued long after. It was the resistance to this legacy and the continued white supremacist ideology and the racist violence that came with it to uphold it of the White League and that ilk that compelled 15-year-old Claudette Colvin to not give up her seat on a bus in Jim Crow, Montgomery, Alabama on March 2nd, 1955. Colvin said that she was motivated by what she was learning in school about the Constitution and African American history, declaring that she knew she had rights. She said in a 2013 interview that, quote, "It felt like Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on another shoulder, and I could not move," end quote. Yes, you heard me right. 2013. Ms. Colvin is still alive. She's 81 years old. So the legacy of the struggle against white supremacist violence is not a relic of a long dead past in this country. Our freedom fighters in that struggle are still quite alive to tell the tale, many of them, and that is enough reason for me to be extremely dubious of the outcome of these hearings on this January 6th insurrection. The government is going to respond to white racist terrorist violence the way it always has, to do not much about it. So, of course, there is continued racist police terrorism today in cases like Breonna Taylor's and Ahmaud Arbery's, where, yes, the community members colluded with the police and vice versa to cover up a murder, or Elijah McClain's, which again clearly exposes how every institution in society continues to uphold white supremacist ideology and the violence against Black people, from a regular citizen believing a young boy enjoying his music as he walked from the store is a suspicious threat, to the cops treating the slightly built McClain as if he were a muscle-bound, roid-raging MMA fighter, to the EMTs who mischaracterized that child for a fully grown adult and shot him up with a powerful sedative, even though he was unresponsive from the cops, rendering him unconscious already. This has been the America we have lived in all our entire existence here. If we are ever going to chart a path for a better future, we have got to deal with this present reality as it exists right now, because the history of white supremacist terrorism is not a thing of the distant past. It is an all too common threat for us right now. And I doubt that Christopher Wray will say that in his testimony. I don't think he said anything close to that, because he's the head of an agency that's never been committed to ending it in a society that's been all too invested in ignoring it. So ending this campaign of racial terrorism is up to us, my friends, not the FBI, not Congress, not politicians. It's us, organizing, educating, agitating, and pushing for better, changing this society from the top to the bottom, pushing for justice, pushing for peace. It's us. Because as Assata Shakur taught us, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.